Picture this. You're sitting in your car outside the office building where you've worked for 8 years, holding a termination letter that was handed to you 30 minutes ago. Your company is about to close the biggest deal in its history, a $2.4 billion acquisition that would make everyone rich beyond their wildest dreams. The irony? You're the one who wrote the legal clause that makes the entire deal possible, and they just fired you 3 days before it closes. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Chen, and until last Tuesday I was the chief legal counsel at Meridian Technologies, mid-sized software company based in Austin, Texas. For 8 years I had been the guy behind every major contract, every partnership agreement, and every legal maneuver that kept this company afloat and thriving. I wasn't the CEO making headlines or the CTO getting tech magazine covers. I was the quiet legal mind working in the background, making sure everything we did was bulletproof. Meridian specialized in enterprise data analytics software. Think of those massive dashboards that Fortune 500 companies use to track everything from customer behavior to supply chain efficiency. We weren't the biggest player in the market, but we had something special. Our proprietary algorithm could process and analyze data streams in real time with unprecedented accuracy. While competitors took hours or even days to generate comprehensive reports, our system delivered actionable insights in minutes. The company was founded in 2016 by two Stanford graduates, Rebecca Walsh and David Martinez. Rebecca, our CEO, had the vision and the business acumen. David, our CTO, had the technical brilliance to make that vision reality. By the time I joined in late 2016, they had already secured their Series A funding and were starting to gain traction with mid-market clients. I came on board after spending 6 years at a top-tier law firm in Dallas, specializing in corporate law and mergers and acquisitions. The transition from big law to in-house counsel was supposed to be a step toward better work-life balance, but anyone who's worked at a high-growth tech startup knows that balance is often just a recruiting buzzword. Still, there was something electric about being part of a company that was building something genuinely innovative. My first major contribution came just 3 months after joining. We were negotiating a partnership with Dataflow Industries, one of the largest data processing companies in the country. The deal would give us access to their client base of over 10,000 enterprise customers, while they would integrate our real-time analytics capabilities into their existing platform. It was a game-changer for both companies, but the legal complexities were staggering. The negotiations dragged on for months. Dataflow's legal team was notorious for their aggressive tactics and their ability to structure deals heavily in their favor. They had a team of 12 attorneys working on the agreement, while I was essentially handling it solo with occasional support from outside counsel. The pressure was immense. This deal represented potentially 300% revenue growth for Meridian in the first year alone. The breakthrough came when I proposed a revenue-sharing structure that was tied to performance metrics, rather than fixed percentages. Instead of the traditional model where we would pay Dataflow a flat percentage of revenue from their referred clients, I created a tiered system. If their clients achieved certain performance benchmarks using our analytics, improved efficiency, cost savings, revenue growth, both companies would share in the upside through escalating revenue splits. More importantly, I included a clause that I called the innovation protection provision. This clause stated that any improvements, modifications, or derivative technologies developed as a result of the partnership would be jointly owned, but with specific licensing terms that heavily favored the company that initiated the innovation. Given that Meridian was the smaller, more agile company, this essentially meant we would retain significant control over any technological advances that emerged from the collaboration. The Dataflow deal closed in March 2017, and the results exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months, we had onboarded over 2,000 of their enterprise clients. Our revenue jumped from $12 million annually to $47 million. More importantly, the integration process led to significant improvements in our core algorithm. The massive data volumes from Dataflow's clients allowed us to refine our processing capabilities in ways that would have taken years to achieve organically. This success established my reputation within the company. Rebecca started involving me in strategic planning sessions. David would run technical partnerships by me before even preliminary discussions began. I wasn't just the legal guy anymore. I was becoming a key strategic advisor. Over the next few years, I structured dozens of deals that fueled Meridian's growth. There was the acquisition of a small AI startup in San Francisco that gave us predictive analytics capabilities. I negotiated licensing agreements with 3 major cloud providers that expanded our infrastructure globally. When we decided to go after government contracts, I spent months learning federal procurement law and successfully landed our first Department of Defense contract worth $89 million over 5 years. Each deal taught me something new about the business and about the legal landscape we operated in. But more importantly, each success made me more confident in my ability to see around corners, to anticipate potential issues and structure agreements that protected Meridian's interests while still being attractive to partners. The company culture during these growth years was intoxicating. We had that startup energy where everyone believed we were changing the world. Friday afternoon beer sessions often turned into impromptu strategy sessions. Rebecca had this way of making everyone feel like they were personally responsible for the company's success. And in many ways, we were. With only 127 employees at our peak, every person's contribution was visible and meaningful. I developed particularly close working relationships with our key executives. Rebecca trusted my judgment on deal structure and risk assessment. David relied on me to translate technical capabilities into legal protections and commercial advantages. Our CFO, Jennifer Park, and I worked hand in hand on the financial modeling for every major agreement. But perhaps most importantly, I built strong relationships with our clients and partners. Unlike many legal counsels who stay in the background, Rebecca encouraged me to be client-facing when deals required complex legal explanations. This gave me direct insight into what our clients valued most about our services and what pain points they were experiencing with competitors. By 2021, Meridian had grown to $180 million in annual revenue. We had offices in Austin, San Francisco, and Atlanta, with over 5,000 enterprise clients and partnerships with most major cloud providers and data companies. Our technology had evolved far beyond the original real-time analytics platform. We now offered predictive modeling, automated reporting, compliance monitoring, and custom analytics solutions for specific industries. The company's valuation had reached $1.2 billion in our last funding round, making us an official unicorn. But Rebecca and David were already talking about what came next. They weren't interested in running a public company, and the market dynamics were changing rapidly. Larger players like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon were all developing competing analytics platforms. The question wasn't whether we could continue growing as an independent company, it was whether we could grow fast enough to stay ahead of the giants who were now paying attention to our space. That's when the acquisition discussions began in earnest. Rebecca had been fielding informal inquiries for over a year, but in late 2021 the conversations became serious. 3 major tech companies had expressed concrete interest. Amazon Web Services wanted our real-time processing capabilities for their cloud analytics suite. Microsoft was interested in integrating our technology into their business intelligence platform, and somewhat surprising, Oracle had emerged as an aggressive bidder. Oracle's interest caught everyone off guard initially. They weren't known for their analytics prowess, and their corporate culture seemed like oil and water compared to Meridian's startup energy. But their offer was compelling not just financially, but strategically. They wanted to use Meridian's technology as the foundation for a completely new business unit, focused on real-time enterprise analytics. Instead of just acquiring our technology, they were proposing to build an entire division around it, with significant autonomy and resources. The preliminary discussions with Oracle began in December. Their corporate development team was led by Susan Rodriguez, a veteran dealmaker who had orchestrated some of Oracle's most successful acquisitions over the past decade. From our first meeting, it was clear that Oracle understood both the technical value of what we had built and the market opportunity it represented. What made the Oracle discussions particularly interesting was their approach to the deal structure. Rather than a straightforward acquisition where Meridian would be absorbed into Oracle's existing divisions, they were proposing what they called a strategic integration model. Meridian would operate as a semi-autonomous subsidiary, maintaining its own brand, culture, and decision-making processes, while gaining access to Oracle's massive sales organization, global infrastructure, and enterprise client base. The financial terms were staggering. Oracle's initial offer valued Meridian at $2.1 billion, nearly double our last private valuation, but more importantly, the deal structure included significant earn-out provisions tied to revenue and market penetration goals. If the integration succeeded and the new business unit hit its 3-year targets, the total deal value could reach $2.8 billion. For me personally, the Oracle deal represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward since joining Meridian. This wasn't just about personal financial gain, though my equity stake would certainly be life-changing. It was about seeing a company I had helped build from 47 employees reach the absolute pinnacle of success in our industry. The due diligence process began in January 2022 and would continue for months. Oracle's legal team was thorough to the point of obsession, reviewing every contract, every partnership agreement, every intellectual property filing, and every regulatory compliance document in Meridian's history. As chief legal counsel, I was essentially the primary interface for this entire process. I spent countless hours in conference rooms and on video calls, walking Oracle's attorneys through the intricacies of our legal structure. They wanted to understand not just what agreements we had in place, but the strategic thinking behind each one. Why had we structured the data flow partnership with joint ownership provisions? What was the rationale behind the licensing terms in our cloud provider agreement? How had we managed to secure such favorable terms in our government contracts? Each question required detailed explanations, often supported by historical context and business justification. I found myself essentially telling the story of Meridian's growth through the lens of our legal and commercial evolution. It was exhausting, but also deeply satisfying. I was demonstrating the strategic value of every deal I had structured over the past 5 years. The complexity of the due diligence process also revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated: how integral my work had been to Meridian's success. Oracle's team kept coming back to specific clauses and provisions I had negotiated, noting how these had given Meridian competitive advantages or protected us from potential risk. They were particularly impressed by the innovation protection provision from the Dataflow deal, which had indeed resulted in jointly owned improvements that now formed core components of our technology platform. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. As the due diligence progressed through the spring and summer of 2022, Oracle's enthusiasm for the deal only grew. They began involving senior executives in the discussions, including their chief technology officer and the head of their cloud services division. These weren't just financial or legal conversations anymore. They were strategic planning sessions for how Meridian's technology would be integrated into Oracle's broader platform. The negotiations also revealed Oracle's long-term vision for the acquisition. They weren't just buying our current capabilities, they were betting on our ability to continue innovating in the rapidly evolving analytics space. The semi-autonomous structure they were proposing would allow Meridian to maintain the agility and innovative culture that had driven our success, while providing the resources and scale to compete with the largest players in the market. By September 2022, the fundamental terms of the deal were largely agreed upon. The purchase price had actually increased to $2.4 billion, reflecting both Oracle's growing confidence in the acquisition and some competitive pressure from Microsoft, who had submitted a counteroffer in late August. The deal structure remained largely unchanged. Meridian would become a wholly owned subsidiary of Oracle, but with significant operational autonomy and ambitious growth targets tied to substantial earn-out payments. The legal documentation for a $2.4 billion acquisition is extraordinarily complex. Beyond the basic purchase agreement, there were employment contracts for key personnel, intellectual property transfer agreements, regulatory compliance filings, tax optimization structures, and dozens of ancillary agreements covering everything from office leases to customer contract assignments. As lead counsel for Meridian, I was responsible for coordinating our side of this documentation process. We brought in external counsel from 2 major law firms to handle specialized aspects of the transaction, but I remained the primary point of contact and the strategic lead for all legal matters. This meant reviewing every document, coordinating with Oracle's legal team on revisions, and ensuring that all agreements properly reflected the business terms that had been negotiated. One of the most critical aspects of the documentation was what we called the continuation provisions, the legal mechanisms that would ensure Meridian's existing contracts and partnerships would remain valid and enforceable after the acquisition. This was particularly complex because many of our agreements included change of control provisions that could potentially be triggered by the Oracle acquisition. I spent weeks working through these issues, negotiating with existing partners to obtain necessary consents and waivers, and in some cases restructuring agreements to eliminate potential complications. The data flow partnership was particularly challenging because their change of control provisions were quite restrictive, and they initially viewed the Oracle acquisition as potentially competitive with their own business interests. The breakthrough came when I proposed a modified structure for the data flow relationship post-acquisition. Instead of simply transferring the existing agreement to Oracle, we would create a new three-party arrangement where data flow, Meridian, and Oracle would each have defined roles and responsibilities. This actually enhanced the value of the partnership for all parties while addressing data flow's competitive concerns. By November 2022, all major legal and business issues had been resolved. The acquisition agreement was substantially complete, with only minor technical and administrative matters remaining. Oracle's board had approved the transaction, and Meridian's board had voted unanimously to accept Oracle's offer. We were targeting a closing date in mid-December, with all regulatory approvals expected to be completed by then. The mood within Meridian during these final weeks was electric. Everyone knew that we were days away from the most successful exit in the company's history. Rebecca and David had been transparent with the entire team about the acquisition from the beginning, and the financial benefits extended well beyond the founding team and early investors. Our employee stock option plan meant that even relatively junior employees would receive life-changing payouts. For me personally, these were some of the most professionally satisfying weeks of my career. I had successfully navigated one of the most complex legal transactions I had ever been involved in, and the completion of this deal would establish my reputation as one of the top M&A attorneys in the Austin tech scene. I was already fielding inquiries from other companies who wanted to discuss potential general counsel positions. But there was also an underlying tension that I was trying to ignore. Throughout the acquisition process, I had noticed subtle changes in my relationship with Rebecca and Dave. Conversations that used to be collaborative and strategic had become more transactional and directive. I attributed this to the stress of managing a complex acquisition while running a growing business. But looking back, I think something more fundamental was shifting. The first real warning sign came in early December, just 2 weeks before the scheduled closing. Rebecca asked me to join her for what she described as a strategic planning discussion about post-acquisition organizational structure. I assumed this would be a conversation about my role in the combined organization and how the legal function would be structured after the Oracle integration. Instead, Rebecca began the conversation by discussing Oracle's plans for operational efficiency and organizational optimization following the acquisition. She explained that Oracle had very specific ideas about how the legal function should be structured in their subsidiary companies, and that they preferred to work with legal teams who had extensive experience with their corporate culture and operational requirements. The conversation with Rebecca lasted 43 minutes, and by the end of it I knew my time at Meridian was over. She never said it directly. Rebecca was too smart for that, but her message was crystal clear. Oracle wanted to bring in their own legal team, people who understood their systems, their culture, their way of doing business. My role would be transitional, helping with the handover and then exploring other opportunities within the Oracle ecosystem. I sat in that conference room looking out at the Austin skyline, trying to process what was happening. 8 years of my life, hundreds of deals, thousands of hours of work, and it was all being reduced to a transitional role. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent the last 11 months making this acquisition possible, and now I was being told I wouldn't be part of the company I had helped sell. Rebecca tried to soften the blow by talking about severance packages and transition timelines, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My mind was racing through all the legal documents I had prepared, all the provisions I had negotiated, all the protections I had built into the acquisition structure. There was something nagging at me, something important, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The meeting ended with Rebecca asking me to keep the discussion confidential until after the holidays. The acquisition was still scheduled to close on December 15th, and she didn't want anything to disrupt the final step. I agreed, partly because I was still in shock, but mostly because I needed time to think through my options. I spent the next 3 days in a strange kind of professional limbo. I was still the chief legal counsel, still responsible for coordinating the final closing documents, still the primary point of contact for Oracle's legal team. But now I was doing it knowing that I was essentially working myself out of a job. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. During those 3 days, I found myself reviewing every document I had prepared for the acquisition with new eyes. I wasn't just looking for legal compliance or structural issues anymore. I was looking for leverage. If Rebecca and David thought they could discard me after I had made this deal possible, they were about to learn that I understood the legal landscape better than they realized. The revelation came on a Thursday evening, December 8th. I was in my office, going through the final version of the acquisition agreement one more time, when I reached Section 12. This was a provision I had negotiated with Oracle's team back in September, designed to ensure that critical employees would remain with the company through the integration process. The section included a detailed schedule identifying specific employees whose departure within 18 months of closing would trigger financial penalties and potential deal modifications. The list included obvious candidates like David Martinez, our CTO, and Jennifer Park, our CFO. But there, in subsection 12.74 was my name, Marcus Chen, Chief Legal Counsel, whose continued employment is deemed essential for proper integration of existing contractual obligations and maintenance of key client relationships. I had negotiated this provision myself, back when I thought I was securing protections for the entire senior team. Oracle's legal team had been particularly insistent on including me in this section, noting that my intimate knowledge of Meridian's contract portfolio was crucial for the integration process. If I left or was terminated within 18 months of closing, Oracle could reduce the purchase price by up to $47 million and extend the earnout timeline by up to 12 months. But there was more. I kept reading, and in subsection 7 I found what I was looking for. In the event that any key personnel identified in this section 12.7 is terminated without cause, prior to closing, the acquiring party reserves the right to renegotiate the purchase price, or, at their sole discretion, withdraw from the transaction entirely. This was the clause that changed everything. Rebecca and David could fire me after the deal closed, but they couldn't fire me before closing without potentially killing the entire acquisition. And given that Oracle had specifically identified me as essential personnel, any termination would almost certainly be viewed as a material change to the deal structure. I sat back in my chair, staring at the document on my screen. I had written the very provision that protected me from the betrayal that was already in motion. The beauty of it was that this wasn't some obscure legal technicality. It was a straightforward contractual obligation that I had negotiated specifically to protect key personnel during the acquisition process. Over the next few hours, I carefully reviewed every related document, making sure I understood all the implications. The key personnel provisions were integrated throughout the acquisition structure. They were referenced in the purchase price calculations, the earnout formulas, the regulatory filings, and even the financing agreements that Oracle had arranged to fund the acquisition. Removing me from the equation at this stage would require extensive renegotiation of multiple agreements, regulatory refilings, and potentially even new board approvals from Oracle. The complexity and delay would almost certainly push the closing date well into the new year, if not kill the deal entirely. But understanding the legal landscape was only half the battle. I needed to understand the business dynamics that had led to this situation. Why were Rebecca and David willing to alienate their chief legal counsel just days before the biggest deal in company history? What had changed in their relationship with Oracle that made them think they could simply discard me? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Park, our CFO, stopped by my office on Friday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss some final financial documentation for the closing. But after we finished the business discussion, she lingered in my office, clearly having something else on her mind. "Marcus," she said finally, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise me that this conversation never happened. I nodded, curious about what had prompted this level of secrecy. Oracle made Rebecca and David an offer, she continued, not just for the company, but for them personally. They want Rebecca to run the new business unit, and they want David to lead the technical integration. The compensation packages are significant. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. But Oracle was very specific about the organizational structure they wanted. They have their own legal team, their own operational systems, their own way of doing things. Rebecca and David were told that bringing in outside personnel, even very qualified people, would complicate the integration process. The pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just about Oracle's preferences, it was about Rebecca and David securing their own positions in the post-acquisition company. They had been offered roles that would make them extraordinarily wealthy and powerful within Oracle's organization, but only if they agreed to Oracle's staffing requirements. What about the key personnel provisions? Oracle specifically required that I be retained through the integration process. Jennifer looked uncomfortable. I think they assumed that those provisions were just standard acquisition language. Rebecca and David probably told them that you would be willing to step aside if the compensation was adequate. This was the moment I realized the full scope of the betrayal. Rebecca and David hadn't just decided to fire me. They had actively misrepresented my status to Oracle, potentially creating a situation where the acquisition could fail due to their deception. I spent the weekend developing my strategy. I couldn't simply confront Rebecca and David directly. That would give them time to develop countermeasures or potentially even accelerate my termination. Instead, I needed to position myself so that any attempt to remove me would immediately trigger the contractual protections I had built into the deal. My first step was to document everything. I prepared a detailed memo outlining my role in the acquisition, the key personnel provisions, and the potential consequences of my departure. I also compiled a comprehensive file of all the agreements, contracts, and legal structures that I had personally negotiated, and that would require my involvement in the post-acquisition integration. More importantly, I reached out directly to Susan Rodriguez, Oracle's lead dealmaker, to schedule a pre-closing coordination call. This was a routine practice in complex acquisitions, where key personnel from both sides would review final details and ensure smooth execution of the closing process. The call was scheduled for Monday morning, December 12th, just 3 days before the planned closing date. I knew that this conversation would determine whether my legal protections were worth anything or whether Rebecca and David had already maneuvered around them. Susan Rodriguez was professional and direct as always. She wanted to review the final checklist of closing conditions and ensure that there were no outstanding issues that could delay the transaction. We spent about 20 minutes going through technical details, regulatory compliance, and financial documentation. Then I brought up the key personnel provisions. Susan, I want to make sure we're aligned on the post-closing integration timeline. The key personnel provisions in Section 12 outline a pretty specific retention schedule, and I want to ensure that Oracle is comfortable with the transition process we've planned. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, I'm glad you brought that up, Susan replied. Those provisions are actually quite important to our integration planning. Your continued involvement is essential for the first 18 months, particularly given your knowledge of the contract portfolio and client relationships. This was exactly what I needed to hear. Oracle was counting on my continued involvement, and they viewed the key personnel provisions as integral to the deal structure. Has there been any discussion about modifications to those provisions? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Not from our side, Susan said. Why do you ask? Is there something we should be aware of? This was the moment of truth. I could either reveal what I knew about Rebecca and David's plans, potentially creating a crisis just days before closing, or I could continue to play along and hope that my contractual protections would be sufficient. I chose a middle path. I just want to ensure that everyone's expectations are aligned, I said. There's been some discussion about organizational structure post-closing, and I want to make sure that Oracle's requirements are properly communicated to the Meridian team. Susan's tone became more serious. Marcus, The key personnel provisions were non-negotiable from our perspective. We've structured the entire integration plan around the assumption that you and the other identified personnel will remain with the company through the transition period. Any changes to that structure would require significant renegotiation of the deal terms. After the call ended, I sat in my office considering my options. I now had confirmation that Oracle viewed my continued employment as essential to the deal. I also had strong evidence that Rebecca and David were planning to terminate me without Oracle's knowledge or consent. The question was how to use this information to protect myself, without destroying the acquisition that I had spent 11 months helping to create. That afternoon, I received an email from Rebecca asking me to attend a brief administrative meeting on Tuesday morning. The timing was suspicious. Tuesday, December 13th, was just 2 days before the scheduled close. Any major personnel changes that close to closing would create significant complications. I spent Monday evening preparing for what I suspected would be my termination meeting. I drafted a detailed letter outlining the key personnel provisions and the potential consequences of my departure. I also prepared a comprehensive analysis of all the legal and contractual issues that would need to be addressed if I were no longer available to handle the integration process. More importantly, I prepared a strategy that would force Rebecca and David to either abandon their plans or risk the entire acquisition. Tuesday morning arrived with unusually heavy December rain in Austin. I arrived at the office early, around 6:30 a.m., and spent 2 hours reviewing every document one final time. By 8:30 a.m., I was as prepared as I could be for whatever Rebecca had planned. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main conference room. When I arrived, I found Rebecca, David, and Jennifer already seated at the table. The mood was somber, and I could tell that this was going to be exactly the conversation I had been dreading. Rebecca started with the usual pleasantries about the success of the acquisition and the importance of everyone's contributions. But within a few minutes, she transitioned to the real purpose of the meeting. Marcus, as we've discussed, Oracle has very specific requirements for the post-acquisition organizational structure, she began. They prefer to work with legal teams who have extensive experience with their corporate culture and operational system. David jumped in with additional justification about the complexity of the integration and the need for specialized expertise. Jennifer remained silent, but I could see that she was uncomfortable with the entire situation. We've arranged for a very generous severance package, Rebecca continued, and Oracle has indicated that there may be consulting opportunities available if you're interested in maintaining some involvement with the company. She slid a folder across the table containing what I assumed was my termination letter and severance agreement. This was my moment. I didn't touch the folder. Instead, I pulled out my own prepared documents and placed them on the table. Rebecca, before we proceed, I think there are some legal issues we need to discuss, I said calmly. Specifically, Section 12.7 of the acquisition agreement and the key personnel provisions. The room went silent. Rebecca and David exchanged glances, and I could see that they hadn't expected me to bring up the contractual implications of my termination. I've prepared a detailed analysis of the potential consequences if I'm terminated prior to closing, I continued. Oracle has the right to renegotiate the purchase price or withdraw from the transaction entirely. Given that they've specifically identified me as essential personnel, any termination would almost certainly be viewed as a material change to the deal. Rebecca's expression shifted from sympathetic to defensive. Marcus, I'm sure we can work through any technical issues with Oracle's legal team. Actually, I replied, I spoke with Susan Rodriguez yesterday. Oracle views the key personnel provisions as integral to their integration planning. They've structured the entire deal around the assumption that I'll remain with the company through the 18-month transition period. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see David running calculations in his head, trying to figure out how my departure would affect the deal timeline and their own compensation packages. What exactly are you suggesting? Rebecca asked, her tone now clearly hostile. I'm suggesting that any personnel changes prior to closing need to be carefully coordinated with Oracle to ensure compliance with the acquisition agreement, I replied. Otherwise, we risk jeopardizing the entire transaction. This was the moment when I realized that I had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Rebecca and David weren't just planning to fire me. They were planning to fire me and then convince Oracle that it was a mutual decision that wouldn't affect the deal structure. Marcus, David said finally, we appreciate your concerns, but we've already discussed this with Oracle. They understand the situation and they're comfortable with the transition plan. This was a lie, and I knew it. My conversation with Susan Rodriguez had made it clear that Oracle was counting on my continued involvement, but Rebecca and David were gambling that they could present Oracle with a fait accompli and force them to accept the change rather than risk the deal. In that case, I said, I'd like to schedule a three-way call with Susan Rodriguez to ensure that everyone is aligned on the transition plan and the implications for the key personnel provisions. The room erupted. Rebecca and David began talking over each other, explaining why such a call wasn't necessary and how it could create unnecessary complications just days before closing. But I could see the panic in their eyes. They knew that direct communication with Oracle would expose their deception. The meeting ended without resolution, but the battle lines were now clearly drawn. Rebecca and David were determined to remove me before closing, believing that they could manage the consequences with Oracle after the fact. I was equally determined to use my contractual protections to force them to honor their commitment. What none of us anticipated was that Oracle had been monitoring the situation more closely than anyone realized, and that my phone call with Susan Rodriguez had triggered a comprehensive review of the key personnel provisions and their implications for the deal structure. The next 48 hours would determine whether 8 years of work would end in triumph or disaster, and whether the legal protections I had built into the deal would be strong enough to withstand the betrayal that was already in motion. Wednesday, December 14th, began with an unexpected phone call at 6:47 a.m. I was at home, having coffee and reviewing my legal strategy one final time before what I knew would be the most important day of my professional life. The caller ID showed Susan Rodriguez from Oracle. Marcus, I apologize for calling so early, she said, her tone more serious than I had ever heard it. We need to talk immediately. Can you be available for a conference call at 8? This is regarding the key personnel provisions and some concerns that have been raised about the closing tomorrow. My heart rate spiked. Something had happened overnight. Something that had prompted Oracle to take action just hours before the scheduled closing. Of course, I replied. Should I expect anyone else from Meridian to be on the call? No, Susan said firmly. This is a direct conversation between Oracle and you regarding your contractual obligations and the implications of any changes to your employment status. The call was scheduled for 11. I spent the next 4 hours preparing for what I suspected would be the most consequential conversation of my career. I reviewed every aspect of the key personnel provisions, documented my role in the acquisition process, and prepared detailed explanations of the potential consequences if I were removed from the transaction. At exactly 11:00 a.m., I dialed into the conference call. Susan Rodriguez was joined by Oracle's Chief Legal Officer, Thomas Barrett, and their Director of Corporate Development, Lisa Chang. The presence of such senior executives made it clear that Oracle was taking this situation extremely seriously. Marcus, Susan began, we've received some conflicting information about your status with Meridian, and we need to understand the facts before we proceed with tomorrow's closing. Thomas Barrett took over the conversation. Yesterday afternoon, we received a call from Rebecca Walsh, indicating that you had decided to resign from Meridian effective immediately, and that this resignation was unrelated to the acquisition. She assured us that your departure would not affect the closing process or the integration timeline. I felt a surge of anger mixed with vindication. Rebecca had tried to preemptively manage the situation by framing my departure as voluntary, hoping to avoid triggering the key personnel provisions. That's not accurate, I replied carefully. I have not resigned from Meridian. In fact, I've been working diligently to ensure that all legal requirements are met for tomorrow's closing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, Lisa Chang said, can you explain what's happening from your perspective? Because what we're hearing from Meridian's leadership doesn't align with the contractual obligations we've established. This was my opportunity to present the full picture. I explained the conversation with Rebecca about transitional roles and Oracle's supposed preference for their own legal team. I detailed the meeting on Tuesday where I was presented with a severance package just 2 days before closing. I outlined the key personnel provisions and their implications for the deal structure. Most importantly, I provided a detailed analysis of all the legal and contractual issues that would need to be addressed if I were no longer available to handle the integration process. This included ongoing litigation, regulatory compliance matters, and complex contract negotiations that were scheduled to continue well into the post-acquisition period. The Oracle executives listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific provisions or timelines. By the end of my presentation, it was clear that they understood the full scope of the situation. "Marcus," Thomas Barrett said finally, "based on what you've told us, any termination of your employment prior to closing would constitute a material breach of the acquisition agreement. More importantly, it would create significant operational risks for the integration process." Susan Rodriguez added, "We've spent months planning the integration based on your continued involvement." The key personnel provisions weren't just legal formalities, they were essential business requirements. Lisa Chang delivered the crucial information. "We're going to need to speak with Rebecca and David immediately to clarify their intentions and ensure compliance with the acquisition agreement. If they're planning to terminate you prior to closing, we need to discuss the implications for the deal structure." The call ended with Oracle scheduling an emergency meeting with Meridian's leadership for 2. I was instructed to remain available but not to participate in the initial discussion. Oracle wanted to hear Meridian's position directly before determining next steps. I spent the lunch hour in a state of nervous anticipation. I had played my strongest card, but I still didn't know whether it would be enough to prevent my termination or protect the acquisition. The next few hours would determine whether 8 years of work would end in triumph or disaster. At 2:15 p.m., I received a text message from Jennifer Park. "Emergency board meeting called for 4:00 p.m. Oracle is threatening to walk away from the deal." This was the moment I had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. Oracle was taking the key personnel provisions seriously, but they were also prepared to abandon the acquisition if Meridian couldn't provide adequate assurances about compliance with the agreement. At 3:30 p.m., Rebecca called my cell phone directly. Her tone was a mixture of anger and desperation. "Marcus, we need to talk immediately. Oracle is threatening to postpone the closing unless we can resolve this personnel issue. You need to help us find a solution." The irony was breathtaking. After trying to fire me 2 days before the biggest deal in company history, Rebecca was now asking for my help to save the acquisition. "What kind of solution did you have in mind?" I asked. "We need you to confirm to Oracle that you're willing to work with their legal team during the transition period," she said. "We can structure your role to focus on integration support rather than day-to-day legal operation." This was a significant concession from Rebecca's original position, but it still wasn't addressing the fundamental issue. Oracle had required my continued employment as chief legal counsel, not as a consultant or integration specialist. "Rebecca, the key personnel provisions are very specific about my role and responsibilities. Any changes to my employment status would require Oracle's explicit consent and potentially trigger renegotiation of the deal terms." There was silence on the other end of the line. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked finally. This was the question I had been preparing for since Tuesday's meeting. I had 3 primary objectives: secure my position through the 18-month transition period, ensure appropriate compensation for my role in the acquisition, and establish clear boundaries around my post-acquisition responsibility. "I want Oracle to confirm that the key personnel provisions will be honored as written," I said. "I want my role and compensation to remain unchanged through the transition period, and I want direct reporting relationships that ensure I can effectively manage the legal integration process." Rebecca agreed to present these requirements to the board and to Oracle's team. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 4:00 p.m., with Oracle executives participating via video conference. I wasn't invited to the board meeting, but Jennifer Park kept me updated via text messages throughout the afternoon. The negotiations were intense and sometimes heated, with Oracle threatening multiple times to walk away from the deal if Meridian couldn't provide adequate assurances about key personnel compliance. At 6:45 p.m., I received a call from Thomas Barrett directly. Marcus, we've reached an agreement with Meridian's board that addresses our concerns about the key personnel provision. We're prepared to proceed with tomorrow's closing, but we need your explicit confirmation that you're committed to fulfilling your contractual obligations through the 18-month transition period. The terms were better than I had hoped. Oracle had insisted that I retain my role as chief legal counsel with full authority over legal matters during the integration period. My compensation would include the original equity arrangements, plus additional retention bonuses tied to a successful completion of integration milestone. Most importantly, I would report directly to Oracle's legal team rather than to Rebecca or David, ensuring independence in managing the transition process. I'm committed to honoring the key personnel provisions as written. I confirm. I look forward to working with Oracle's team to ensure a successful integration. The closing was rescheduled for 2:00 p.m. on December 15 to allow time for final documentation revisions, reflecting the clarified personnel arrangement. I spent the evening reviewing the modified agreements and preparing for what would finally be the culmination of 11 months of intensive work. Thursday morning, December 15th, arrived with clear skies and temperatures in the mid-60s. Unusual for Austin in December, but somehow fitting for such an extraordinary day. I arrived at the office at 8:00 a.m. to find the entire building buzzing with nervous energy. Today was the day that would transform everyone's lives. The closing process for a $2.4 billion acquisition involves dozens of people, hundreds of documents, and thousands of individual tasks that must be completed in precise sequence. As chief legal counsel, I was responsible for coordinating Meridian's side of the process, ensuring that every legal requirement was met and every document was properly executed. The morning was consumed with final document reviews, signature authorizations, and coordination with various third parties including banks, regulatory agencies, and key clients. Oracle's legal team had arrived in Austin the previous evening, and their meticulous attention to detail was both impressive and occasionally frustrating. Rebecca and David were professional but distant throughout the morning. Our confrontation over the key personnel provisions had fundamentally altered our working relationship, and it was clear that the post-acquisition period would require careful navigation of these new dynamics. At 1:00 p.m., we gathered in Meridian's main conference room for the final closing sequence. The table was covered with signature pages, wire transfer authorizations, and regulatory compliance documents. Oracle's executives joined via video conference from their headquarters in California. Susan Rodriguez walked through the closing checklist one final time, confirming that all conditions had been met and all documentation was in order. The key personnel provisions were explicitly confirmed, with Thomas Barrett noting that Oracle was counting on my continued leadership of the legal function during the integration period. At 2:17 p.m., Rebecca Walsh signed the final document, transferring ownership of Meridian Technologies to Oracle Corporation. The acquisition was complete. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Champagne appeared from somewhere, and everyone began congratulating each other on completing one of the largest tech acquisitions in Austin's history. The financial impact was staggering. Oracle had just paid $2.4 billion for a company that had been worth $47 million when I joined 8 years earlier. For me personally, the acquisition represented both vindication and transformation. My equity stake in Meridian was now worth approximately $23 million, life-changing money that would provide financial security for decades. More importantly, I had successfully navigated one of the most complex legal and political challenges of my career, proving that preparation and strategic thinking could overcome even the most determined opposition. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that I had protected not just myself but the entire deal structure that would benefit hundreds of employees and investors. The key personnel provisions that I had negotiated 11 months earlier had proven to be more than just legal formalities. They had been the foundation for ensuring continuity and stability during the most critical phase of the acquisition process. As the celebration continued around me, I found myself reflecting on the events of the past week. Rebecca and David had attempted to discard me just days before closing, apparently believing that their relationship with Oracle gave them the power to restructure the deal unilaterally. They had underestimated both Oracle's commitment to the contractual arrangements and my own understanding of the legal protections I had built into the agreement. The irony was perfect. The clause that had saved my job and secured my future was the same provision I had negotiated to protect the very people who had tried to betray me. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being better at your job than your opponents realize. Jennifer Park approached me during the celebration, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Marcus," she said, "I owe you an apology. I should have warned you sooner about what Rebecca and David were planning." "You did warn me," I replied, "and your information was crucial for developing my strategy." We clinked glasses, and Jennifer smiled for the first time in weeks. "So what's next?" she asked. 18 months of integration management, and then early retirement. I laughed. "Actually, I think this is just the beginning. Oracle has some very ambitious plans for the combined company, and they're going to need someone who understands both the legal landscape and the business strategy." As the afternoon wore on, I received congratulatory messages from clients, colleagues, and industry contacts who had heard about the acquisition. The legal community in Austin was small and tight-knit, and word traveled fast about major deals and the attorneys who had managed them. More importantly, I received a personal call from Thomas Barrett, Oracle's chief legal officer. "Marcus, I wanted to thank you personally for your professionalism throughout this process," he said. "The way you handled the personnel situation demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and legal expertise that Oracle values." He paused for a moment. "I also wanted to let you know that Oracle is planning some significant expansions in the analytics and enterprise software space over the next few years. We're going to need experienced M&A attorneys who understand both the technology sector and the complexities of large-scale acquisition. I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might interest you after the integration period is complete." This was an unexpected development. Oracle wasn't just honoring the key personnel provisions, they were actively recruiting me for future opportunities within their broader organization. The day ended with a company-wide celebration at a downtown Austin restaurant. Oracle had flown in executives from California to join the festivities, and the mood was jubilant. Everyone understood that they had just participated in something historic, not just for Meridian but for the entire Austin tech ecosystem. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 years ago, I joined a 47-person startup, hoping to find better work-life balance and more meaningful professional challenges. Instead, I had found myself at the center of one of the most complex and high-stakes business transactions of my career. The events of the past week had tested every skill I had developed over 15 years of legal practice, but they had also revealed something important about the power of preparation, strategic thinking, and understanding the rules of the game better than your opponent. Rebecca and David had learned a costly lesson about the importance of honoring contractual commitments and treating key personnel with appropriate respect. Oracle had learned that they had acquired not just innovative technology and talented people but also the legal and strategic expertise necessary to navigate complex business challenges. And I had learned that sometimes the best protection against betrayal is simply being better at your job than anyone realizes, and ensuring that your value is built into the very structure of the agreements you negotiate. The $2.4 billion acquisition of Meridian Technologies was complete, but the real story was just beginning. The next 18 months would determine whether this acquisition would be remembered as a successful integration or a cautionary tale about the importance of key personnel management in complex business transactions. Either way, I would be there to see it through, protected by the very clause I had written to prevent exactly the situation that had nearly destroyed my career and the deal itself. 6 months after the Oracle acquisition closed, I was sitting in my new office on the 28th floor of Oracle's Austin headquarters, overlooking the same skyline I had gazed at during that fateful conversation with Rebecca Walsh. The view was identical, but everything else had changed in ways I never could have anticipated. The integration process had been both challenging and revelatory. Oracle's approach to managing acquired companies was methodical and comprehensive, but they had honored their commitment to maintaining Meridian's operational autonomy. More importantly, they had recognized that the legal complexities of integrating our technology platform required exactly the kind of institutional knowledge and strategic thinking that I brought to the table. What I hadn't expected was how quickly Oracle would move to expand my role beyond the original 18-month transition period. By March 2023, just 3 months after closing, I had been promoted to Senior Director of Legal Affairs for Oracle's entire analytics division, with responsibility for all M&A activity, partnership agreements, and strategic legal initiatives across multiple business units. The promotion came with a substantial increase in compensation, but more importantly, it came with direct access to Oracle's senior leadership and involvement in their broader strategic planning process. I was no longer just managing the integration of one acquired company. I was helping to shape Oracle's entire approach to growth in the analytics and enterprise software market. The irony wasn't lost on me that Rebecca and David's attempt to remove me from the Meridian deal had actually accelerated my career trajectory beyond anything I could have achieved if things had gone according to their original plan. Their betrayal had forced me to demonstrate my value in ways that ultimately caught Oracle's attention and led to opportunities I never would have had access to otherwise. But the real story of the aftermath began to unfold in April 2023, when I received an unexpected call from a partner at Morrison & Associates, one of Austin's most prestigious law firms. "Marcus, we've been retained by a group of former Meridian employees who are considering legal action related to the Oracle acquisition," the attorney Patricia Morrison explained. "They've specifically requested that we speak with you about some irregularities in the deal structure and the handling of employee equity arrangements." This was concerning. The Oracle acquisition had been meticulously structured to protect employee interests, and I had personally reviewed every aspect of the equity distribution to ensure compliance with both legal requirements and ethical standards. "What kind of irregularities are they alleging?" I asked. "They're claiming that certain employees were promised equity adjustments that were never properly documented or implemented," Patricia replied. "More specifically, they're alleging that Rebecca Walsh and David Martinez made verbal commitments about equity participation that were not reflected in the final acquisition document." Over the next several weeks, I found myself drawn into a complex investigation that would ultimately reveal the full scope of the deception that had surrounded the Oracle acquisition. What I discovered was far more extensive and damaging than the simple attempt to terminate my employment. The investigation began with a detailed review of all employee equity arrangements and the promises that had been made during the acquisition process. Oracle had been scrupulous about ensuring that all existing equity grants and options were properly valued and converted, but the allegations suggested that there had been additional verbal commitments that were never documented. Patricia Morrison's team had interviewed more than 30 former Meridian employees, and a disturbing pattern had emerged. In the months leading up to the acquisition, Rebecca and David had apparently made specific promises to key employees about additional equity grants, retention bonuses, and post-acquisition roles that had never been formalized in writing. The most serious allegations centered around the sales and engineering team. Rebecca had apparently promised the entire sales team that they would receive additional equity grants worth approximately $2 million in aggregate if they helped secure key client commitments that would make the acquisition more attractive to Oracle. Similarly, David had promised several senior engineers that they would receive retention bonuses and guaranteed roles in Oracle's expanded development organization. None of these promises had been documented in the acquisition agreements, and none of the promised benefits had been delivered after closing. The affected employees had assumed that the benefits would be handled as part of the standard post-acquisition integration process, but when they began inquiring about the status of their additional compensation, they were told that no such arrangements existed. The investigation revealed something even more troubling. Rebecca and David had apparently used these undocumented promises as leverage to secure employee cooperation during the critical final months of the acquisition process. Employees who might otherwise have been concerned about job security or compensation changes had been reassured by specific commitments that were never intended to be honored. This was not just a case of poor documentation or miscommunication. It was a systematic pattern of deception that had been used to manipulate employee behavior during the most sensitive phase of the acquisition process. But the investigation also revealed something that directly implicated my own situation. Several employees reported that Rebecca and David had explicitly told them that my departure was part of Oracle's requirements and that it would create additional opportunities for advancement within the combined organization. They had used my supposed termination as evidence that Oracle was committed to promoting existing Meridian employees into senior roles. The realization hit me like a freight train. Rebecca and David hadn't just tried to fire me to secure their own positions with Oracle. They had used the promise of my departure as a recruitment tool to maintain employee loyalty during the acquisition process. This was a level of cynicism and manipulation that I hadn't fully appreciated even during the most contentious moments of our confrontation. They had not only betrayed me personally, but they had weaponized that betrayal to deceive other employees about the true nature of the post-acquisition arrangements. The legal implications were staggering. If these allegations were substantiated, Rebecca and David could face personal liability for fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially even securities fraud if their misrepresentations had affected the valuation or terms of the acquisition. More immediately, Oracle could face significant financial exposure if they were found to have inherited these undocumented commitments as part of the acquisition. The total value of the alleged promises exceeded $15 million, and the legal costs of defending against multiple employee lawsuits could be substantial. I found myself in an extraordinarily difficult position. As Oracle's Senior Director of Legal Affairs, I had a fiduciary duty to protect Oracle's interests and ensure compliance with all legal obligations. But I also had personal knowledge of Rebecca and David's behavior that could be crucial evidence in any legal proceeding. After extensive consultation with Oracle's chief legal officer and external counsel, I made the decision to cooperate fully with the investigation. Oracle's position was clear. They had no tolerance for deceptive practices that could create legal liability or damage their reputation, regardless of who was involved. The investigation expanded throughout the summer of 2023, with Oracle's internal audit team conducting a comprehensive review of all representations made during the acquisition process. They interviewed dozens of current and former employees, reviewed thousands of emails and documents, and reconstructed the timeline of communications between Meridian's leadership and various employee groups. The findings were damning. Oracle's investigation confirmed that Rebecca and David had made extensive verbal commitments that were never documented or approved by the board of directors. More troubling, they had made these commitments while simultaneously negotiating their own employment agreements with Oracle, creating obvious conflicts of interest. The investigation also revealed that Rebecca and David had been less than truthful with Oracle about several aspects of Meridian's operations and employee relations. They had understated the extent of employee concerns about the acquisition, overstated employee enthusiasm for the integration process, and misrepresented the stability of key personnel arrangements. In September 2023, Oracle made the decision to terminate both Rebecca Walsh and David Martinez for cause, citing material misrepresentations made during the acquisition process and breach of their fiduciary duties to both Meridian and Oracle. The terminations were announced internally at Oracle, but the broader implications were kept confidential, while Oracle's legal team worked to address the various employee claims and potential legal exposure. For me personally, the investigation had provided complete vindication of my position during the pre-closing confrontation. Oracle's leadership now understood that my insistence on honoring the key personnel provisions had not been about personal protection. It had been about maintaining the integrity of the entire acquisition process. Thomas Barrett, Oracle's chief legal officer, called me personally after the terminations were announced. "Marcus, I owe you an apology," he said. "When this situation first arose last December, we viewed it as a personnel dispute that needed to be managed carefully. We now understand that you were trying to protect the integrity of the entire transaction." He paused for a moment. "Your professionalism and commitment to ethical practices during that period probably saved Oracle from significant legal and financial exposure. We consider ourselves fortunate to have someone with your judgment and expertise on our legal team." The conversation led to another unexpected development. Oracle offered me a position as Vice President of Legal Affairs for their entire corporate development division, with responsibility for all M&A activity, strategic partnerships, and legal risk management across Oracle's global operation. The promotion would make me one of the youngest VPs in Oracle's history, with compensation that would exceed anything I had ever imagined when I first joined Meridian as a mid-level in-house counsel. More importantly, it would give me the opportunity to work on some of the largest and most complex transactions in the technology industry. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that I had maintained my professional integrity during the most challenging period of my career, and that this integrity had ultimately been recognized and rewarded by one of the most respected companies in the technology industry. The employee litigation was eventually settled in early 2024, with Oracle agreeing to pay approximately $12 million to resolve all claims. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing, but it provided fair compensation to employees who had been misled about their post-acquisition benefit. Rebecca and David faced additional consequences beyond their terminations from Oracle. The Austin business community is small and interconnected, and word of their behavior during the Meridian acquisition spread quickly through professional networks. Both found it difficult to secure new executive positions, and their reputations in the local technology sector were permanently damaged. More significantly, they faced potential personal liability for their actions during the acquisition process. The employee settlements included provisions that preserved the right to pursue individual claims against Rebecca and David personally, and several affected employees chose to pursue those claims. The civil litigation dragged on for more than a year, ultimately settling in late 2024 for undisclosed amounts, but the professional and personal costs to Rebecca and David were substantial and permanent. Jennifer Park, meanwhile, had thrived in the post-acquisition environment. Oracle had recognized her financial expertise and promoted her to Senior Director of Financial Planning for the Analytics Division. She had handled the transition with grace and professionalism, and her candid warnings to me during the pre-closing period had demonstrated exactly the kind of ethical leadership that Oracle valued. The broader lessons of the Meridian acquisition became a case study that Oracle used in training programs for their corporate development team. The importance of thorough due diligence, clear documentation of all commitments, and ethical behavior during acquisition processes was emphasized repeatedly in these sessions. But for me, the most important lesson was about the power of preparation and the importance of understanding the rules of the game better than your opponent. The key personnel provisions that had saved my career were not lucky accidents. They were the result of careful planning, strategic thinking, and a deep understanding of the legal and business dynamics of complex transactions. The clause that had protected me from betrayal was the same provision I had negotiated to protect the very people who had tried to betray me. Sometimes the best protection against deception is simply being better at your job than anyone realizes, and ensuring that your value is built into the very structure of the agreements you negotiate. 2 years after the Oracle acquisition closed, I was invited to speak at a conference for corporate attorneys about managing complex M&A transactions. The title of my presentation was Building Legal Protections into Deal Structure, a Case Study in Risk Management. I never mentioned the specific details of the Meridian acquisition or the personal challenges I had faced during the closing process. Instead, I focused on the technical aspects of key personnel provisions, the importance of thorough documentation, and the strategic value of anticipating potential conflicts before they arise. But everyone in the audience understood the subtext: preparation, integrity, and strategic thinking are the best defenses against betrayal, and sometimes the clause that saves your career is the one you wrote to protect someone else. The $2.4 billion acquisition of Meridian Technologies had been completed successfully, but the real story was about the importance of ethical leadership, the power of preparation, and the ultimate triumph of professionalism over personal ambition. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of attorneys who faced similar challenges in their own career, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about legal strategy or contract negotiation. It was about the importance of maintaining your integrity even when the people around you choose to abandon theirs. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being better at your job than your opponents realize, and ensuring that your value is so deeply embedded in the structure of what you build that removing you becomes impossible without destroying everything they're trying to achieve. The clause that had saved my career was proof that preparation, strategic thinking, and ethical behavior are not just moral imperatives. They're practical advantages that can protect you from betrayal and position you for success beyond anything you originally imagined possible. 3 years after the Oracle acquisition closed, I was sitting in a boardroom at Oracle's headquarters in Redwood City, California, presenting to the company's executive committee about a proposed $3.8 billion acquisition of a European analytics company. As Vice President of Legal Affairs for Corporate Development, I was now responsible for some of the largest and most complex transactions in the technology industry. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now structuring deals larger than the entire Meridian acquisition, using the same strategic principles and legal expertise that had saved my career during those dark December days. But the real vindication came from knowing that everything I had learned from that experience had made me exponentially more effective at protecting Oracle's interests and ensuring successful outcomes for all stakeholders. The European acquisition I was presenting represented a new chapter in Oracle's growth strategy, but it also highlighted how much the corporate development landscape had evolved since the Meridian deal. Regulatory scrutiny had intensified, employee protection requirements had become more stringent, and the due diligence process had become far more comprehensive. More importantly, Oracle had implemented new protocols for managing acquired companies that directly addressed the issues we had encountered during the Meridian integration. Every acquisition now included mandatory employee communication standards, documented commitment tracking, and independent oversight of all personnel-related representation. These changes weren't just administrative improvements, they were fundamental shifts in how Oracle approached the human dynamics of complex business transactions. The company had learned that successful acquisitions required not just financial and technical integration, but also ethical leadership and transparent communication throughout the process. My role in developing these new protocols had been central to my rapid advancement within Oracle's organization. The company valued practical experience over theoretical knowledge, and my firsthand understanding of how personnel issues could derail major transactions had made me an invaluable resource for their corporate development team. But the real measure of my success came from the outcomes of the acquisitions I had managed over the past 3 years. Oracle had completed 17 major acquisitions during my tenure as VP of Legal Affairs, with a combined value of over $23 billion. Every single transaction had closed on schedule, with no material legal complications and no significant employee relations issues. This track record had earned me recognition, not just within Oracle, but throughout the broader technology industry. I had been invited to speak at conferences, serve on advisory boards, and consult with other companies facing similar challenges. The expertise I had developed during the Meridian crisis had become a valuable commodity in a market where successful M&A execution was increasingly rare. The most satisfying aspect of my new role was the opportunity to mentor other attorneys who were navigating similar challenges. Oracle's legal team had grown significantly over the past few years, and I had been responsible for recruiting and developing talent across multiple specialties. One of my most successful hires was Sarah Mitchell, a brilliant attorney who had joined Oracle from a top-tier New York firm. Sarah had been brought in to lead our international transactions, but she had quickly demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and ethical leadership that reminded me of my own journey through the corporate legal landscape. During a particularly complex acquisition of a German software company, Sarah had identified potential issues with employee representation requirements that could have delayed the closing by several months. Her proactive approach to addressing these concerns had not only prevented delays, but had actually strengthened the overall transaction structure. After the successful closing of the German acquisition, Sarah and I were having dinner at a restaurant in Frankfurt, discussing the lessons learned from the transaction. "Marcus, I have to ask you something," she said. "I've heard rumors about what happened during the Meridian acquisition. People say you almost got fired right before the biggest deal in the company's history, and that you somehow used your own legal work to protect yourself. I had been expecting this question for months." The story of the Meridian acquisition had become something of a legend within Oracle's legal department, though the details had been kept confidential out of respect for all parties involved. "It's true. I replied. I was presented with a severance package 2 days before a $2.4 billion deal was supposed to close. The people who tried to fire me had forgotten that I had written the very clause that made their plan impossible to execute. Sarah leaned forward, clearly fascinated by the implication. But how did you know to include that kind of protection in the first place? It seems like you anticipated exactly the situation that ended up happening. This was the question that got to the heart of everything I had learned about strategic legal planning and risk management. I didn't anticipate the specific situation, I explained, but I understood that personnel changes during acquisitions create risks for all parties involved. The key personnel provisions weren't designed to protect me personally. They were designed to protect the integrity of the transaction. I paused, considering how to explain the broader principle. The best legal protections are the ones that align individual interests with organizational success. I wrote those clauses to ensure that Oracle would get the personnel stability they needed for a successful integration. The fact that they also protected me from being fired was a side effect, not the primary purpose. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that the most effective way to protect yourself is to make your protection essential to everyone else's success? Exactly. If you make yourself indispensable to the transaction, then removing you becomes impossible without destroying the value that everyone is trying to create. This conversation led to a broader discussion about the principles of strategic legal planning that I had developed over the years. The most important lesson from the Meridian experience wasn't about defensive tactics or personal protection. It was about the power of aligning individual expertise with organizational objectives. The following month I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the Association of Corporate Counsel. The topic was strategic legal planning in complex M&A transactions, and I had decided to use the Meridian acquisition as a case study, though I would focus on the technical aspects rather than the personal drama. The presentation was scheduled for the main auditorium, with an expected audience of over 800 corporate attorneys from around the world. This would be the largest professional audience I had ever addressed, and the stakes were significant. A successful presentation could establish my reputation as a thought leader in the M&A space, while a poor performance could damage my credibility within the professional community. I spent weeks preparing the presentation, working with Oracle's communications team to develop materials that would be both educational and engaging. The challenge was to explain complex legal concepts in a way that would be accessible to attorneys with varying levels of M&A experience. The presentation was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. on the second day of the conference. I arrived at the convention center early, wanting to familiarize myself with the venue and ensure that all technical aspects of the presentation were working properly. At 9:45 a.m., I was standing behind the stage, reviewing my notes one final time, when I received an unexpected text message from Jennifer Park, my former colleague from Meridian. Marcus, I'm in the audience for your presentation, looking forward to hearing your perspective on what we all went through. You've come a long way from that conference room in Austin. The message was both encouraging and nerve-wracking. Jennifer had been there for the entire Meridian saga, and her presence in the audience would add an extra layer of authenticity to my presentation. But it also meant that someone with first-hand knowledge of the events would be evaluating my account of what had happened. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, I walked onto the stage to address the largest professional audience of my career. The auditorium was packed, with additional attendees watching via live stream from overflow rooms. Good morning, I began. I want to tell you about a $2.4 billion acquisition that almost failed because of a personnel issue that nobody anticipated, and how strategic legal planning prevented a disaster that could have destroyed value for everyone involved. The presentation covered the technical aspects of the Meridian acquisition, focusing on the legal structures and strategic planning principles that had made the transaction successful. I explained the importance of key personnel provisions, the complexity of regulatory compliance, and the critical role of ethical leadership in managing complex business transactions. But I also addressed the human dynamics that had nearly derailed the deal, describing how personal ambitions and poor communication had created risks that threatened the entire transaction. The most important lesson from this experience, I concluded, is that the best legal protections are the ones that align individual interests with organizational success. If you make your expertise essential to the transaction, then protecting you becomes essential to protecting everyone else's interests. The audience response was overwhelmingly positive. During the Q&A session, dozens of attorneys shared their own experiences with similar challenges, and many asked for specific advice about implementing key personnel provisions in their own transaction. After the presentation, I was approached by representatives from several major law firms who were interested in discussing potential consulting opportunities. The presentation had apparently established my reputation as an expert in managing complex M&A transactions, and there was significant demand for that expertise in the current market. But the most meaningful response came from Jennifer Park, who found me after the presentation. "Marcus, that was incredible," she said. "You managed to explain everything that happened without making anyone look bad, while still conveying the importance of ethical leadership and strategic planning." We spent an hour catching up over coffee, discussing how our respective careers had evolved since the Oracle acquisition. Jennifer had continued to thrive at Oracle, recently being promoted to Director of Corporate Finance for the entire analytics division. She had also completed an MBA program and was being considered for several senior executive positions within Oracle's broader organization. "You know," Jennifer said, "I've always wondered what would have happened if you hadn't been able to stop Rebecca and David from firing you. Do you think the Oracle deal would have gone through anyway?" This was a question I had pondered many times over the past 3 years. "I think Oracle would have tried to proceed with the acquisition," I replied. "But the integration would have been far more complicated without the institutional knowledge and relationship continuity that the key personnel provisions were designed to protect." I paused, considering the broader implication. "More importantly, I think the deception and ethical failures that we discovered during the investigation would have eventually surfaced anyway. The difference is that they might have been discovered after the acquisition closed, which would have been much more damaging for Oracle and for all the employees who were affected." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "So in a weird way, their attempt to betray you actually protected everyone else from even worse consequences. Sometimes the best protection against betrayal is simply being better at your job than your opponents realize, and ensuring that your value is so deeply embedded in the structure of what you build that removing you becomes impossible without destroying everything they're trying to achieve." 6 months after the conference presentation, I received a call that would mark the next phase of my career trajectory. The caller was Elizabeth Chen, the Chief Legal Officer of Apex Ventures, one of the largest private equity firms in the United States. "Marcus, we've been following your work at Oracle, and we're impressed by your track record in managing complex acquisitions," she said. "We have an opportunity that we think would be a perfect fit for your expertise." Apex Ventures was in the process of establishing a new practice focused on technology acquisitions, and they were looking for someone with both legal expertise and operational experience to lead the effort. The position would involve managing multiple acquisition processes simultaneously, working with portfolio companies to optimize their legal structures, and developing strategic partnerships with major technology companies. The compensation package was extraordinary, significantly higher than my current Oracle salary, with equity participation that could be worth tens of millions of dollars if the new practice was successful. But more importantly, the role would give me the opportunity to apply everything I had learned from the Meridian experience to a broader range of companies and transactions. After extensive discussions with my family and careful consideration of the opportunity, I decided to accept the position at Apex Venture. The move would represent a significant career advancement, but it would also allow me to help other companies navigate the same challenges that had nearly derailed the Meridian acquisition. My last day at Oracle was both emotional and satisfying. The company had been extraordinarily supportive throughout my tenure, and I had developed strong relationships with colleagues across multiple divisions, but I was also excited about the opportunity to apply my expertise to new challenges and to help shape the future of technology. Thomas Barrett, Oracle's Chief Legal Officer, hosted a farewell reception that was attended by senior executives from across the company. During his remarks, he made a point that captured the essence of my journey from the Meridian crisis to my current success. "Marcus joined Oracle during one of the most challenging periods in our acquisition history," he said. His professionalism, strategic thinking, and ethical leadership not only saved a critical transaction, but also established new standards for how we approach complex acquisition. He paused, looking directly at me. But more importantly, Marcus demonstrated that the best protection against betrayal is simply being indispensable to the success of everyone around you. The clause that saved his career was the same provision he had written to protect the very people who tried to betray him. As I cleaned out my office on that final day, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from a mid-level in-house counsel at a startup to a senior executive at one of the world's largest technology companies. The key personnel clause that had saved my career during the Meridian acquisition had become the foundation for everything I had achieved since then. But the real lesson wasn't about legal strategy or contract negotiation. It was about the importance of maintaining your integrity, even when the people around you choose to abandon theirs. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being better at your job than your opponents realize, and ensuring that your value is so deeply embedded in the structure of what you build that removing you becomes impossible without destroying everything they're trying to achieve. The $2.4 billion acquisition of Meridian Technologies had been completed successfully, but the real story was about the power of preparation, the importance of ethical leadership, and the ultimate triumph of professionalism over personal ambition. As I drove away from Oracle's Austin headquarters for the last time, I thought about that December morning when I had sat in my car, holding a termination letter and wondering if my career was over. The clause that had saved me then had become the foundation for everything I had accomplished since. Sometimes the best protection against betrayal is the work you do when no one is watching, the standards you maintain when no one is measuring, and the value you create when no one is keeping score. The clause that saved my career was proof that preparation, strategic thinking, and ethical behavior are not just moral imperatives, they're practical advantages that can protect you from betrayal and position you for success beyond anything you originally imagined possible. That clause had been written to protect a transaction, but it had ended up protecting a career, exposing a conspiracy, and ultimately ensuring that justice prevailed over deception. Sometimes the most important words you write are the ones that you never expect to need, but that become essential when everything else falls apart. The story of the Meridian acquisition was over, but the lessons it taught would continue to guide my career for decades to come. The best protection against betrayal is simply being better at your job than anyone realizes, and ensuring that your value is built into the very foundation of everything you touch. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.